Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining our first Compass lecture of the semester. We are so excited to have our first speaker, Dan, joining us from SSL. Sorry, so how do you say your last name? Wertheimer. Dan Wertheimer is a lifelong nerd who grew up in San Francisco. While in high school, Dan had a TV repair business, but has built his first telescope with a mirror ground from a ship's porthole, worked at the Exploratorium with Frank Oppenheimer, and watched Star Trek religiously. In the 70s, Dan was in the Homebrew Computer Club with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. While Dan used his computers to search for ET, Jobs and Woz founded Apple. Everyone in the Homebrew Club became ultra rich, except for Dan. Dan started a small scientific instrument company where he designed instruments for NASA and the US Geological Survey. His most successful instrument was used to measure the tiny glue drops that hold together two-ply toilet tissue. This company did not make Dan rich. Dan taught at San Francisco State, Beijing Normal University, Eotvos University in Budapest, and the University of St. Charles in Marseille. With UNESCO, he taught at universities in Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Egypt, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Peru. None of this teaching made Dan rich. Dan went to grad school at Berkeley, where he would later launch the SETI at Home project and the Center for Astronomy, Signal Processing, and Electronics Research. Several of Dan's students became ultra-rich, but not Dan. Dan and his wife, Mary Kate, live in Berkeley, a few blocks from Cal. Mary Kate also went to grad school at Berkeley. She's a virologist who researches deadly viruses while wearing an astronaut suit in her biohazard level 3 lab. Their son, Willy, just graduated with a degree in jazz trumpet, a major pretty much guaranteed not to make him rich as well. Please join me again in welcoming Dan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I want to talk to you about this question, are we alone? Is anybody out there? And a lot of you know the field is called SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And if you want to know how many civilizations are out there in the galaxy, there are a couple of different approaches. There's a theoretical approach where you can just use this equation, the Drake equation, and oh there it goes. Okay, so this is Frank Drake. He died about a year ago, and he worked out this equation where you can calculate how many civilizations we could communicate with in our Milky Way galaxy. And N on the left is how many civilizations we communicate with, and then all you have to do is multiply all those different variables on the right, and you know how many. But the problem is we don't know what any of those numbers are. So it's a way to kind of take a big question and separate it into a big unknown, are we alone, and break it down into a bunch of other unknowns. But you can't really solve this problem in a theoretical way because there's so many unknowns. But it's kind of instructive to walk you through the way this equation works and why we can't solve this problem theoretically and why we don't understand a lot of these numbers. So the first thing is about how many stars there are in the galaxy. We actually do know that. So as you move along this equation, at the beginning, we know something about it. And as you move to the right, we know less and less. And at the end, we know nothing. So we know there's about a couple 100 billion stars in the galaxy. And the next one, the fraction of stars that have planets, the F sub P one, is, if you'd asked me about 30 years ago, are there planets going around other stars? Nobody knew that, but that's all changed in your lifetime. It's really hard to find planets. They're little dinky things, and they don't give off light, and they're right next to these really bright things. It's like looking for a firefly next to a searchlight. And so that took a long time. It's really hard measurement to do. A lot of it was done at Berkeley. And now we know, thanks to the work at Berkeley and others, that there are more planets than there are stars. And so we do know something about the first two things. And then it's a kind of whittling down process. You start with the number of stars, then you say, well, how many planets are going around those stars? And then the next thing is, how many of those planets have the right environment? The N sub E is for environment. And so how many of the planets have are nice temperature, have all the ingredients you need for life, carbon, water, stuff like that to get life started? We don't know, but maybe something like 5%. So you still have a lot of planets, billions of planets, no problem. The next thing is, okay, you got a nice planet, we call it a Goldilocks planet. How often the L, fraction of life, how often does life get started? And we don't know how often that happens. We know it happened very quickly on Earth. As soon as the Earth cooled down, life popped up. So even though we don't understand the exact details of how that happened, self-replicating molecules, because it happened quickly, we think that means that it probably wasn't that hard to do. And maybe it'll happen in other places, but we don't really know. The next thing, F sub I is for intelligence. So once you got, now if you start with stars, now you got planets, then you got good planets. Now you got simple life, you got single cell life. Now, how often do you get from that single celled life to intelligent life? And that is much harder. At least on Earth, it took a long time, billions of years, to get to kind of mammals and humans, to get from simple life to complicated life. So on the other hand, there are some stars that are twice as old. We're about 5 billion years old. Earth is 5 billion years old, but a lot of stars are 10 billion years old. We're sort of middle-aged. So you could imagine that there are probably lots of places where there are intelligent life, but we don't know if that 5 billion years to make life is typical, or whether some planets goes a lot faster, a lot slower. We just don't know. Intelligent. So the next thing is, okay, you got intelligence. The C is for communication. Do they develop ways that we could communicate with them? Communicative technology? Do they have lasers? They have radio, or some way we can talk to them over interstellar distances? We have no idea how often that happens. It only happened one time on Earth. And then the last thing is, after you get into your communicative phase, which we've only been in for like 100 years, where we developed radio technology where we could communicate across the stars. After you get to that phase, how long does the civilization live? The L is for longevity. Do they blow themselves up right away with bioweapons, AI, nuclear, or do they learn to live, get through those bottlenecks, get through their elections, and then they could live a long time. The Earth is going to be around another few billion years. Some stars are quite a bit older. So if we can, learn to stop killing each other, we could last a long time. We don't know how often that happens. Okay, so I want to, before I get into how we're going to look for ET, I want to talk a little bit about how we learned about some of these things. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened at Berkeley. I mentioned the planets are really hard to find. And so they're found indirectly. It's really hard to see a planet with a telescope. A million Earths could fit inside the sun. It doesn't give off light, doesn't have fusion. So what you do is you find them indirectly. So when the planet goes around the star wiggles a little bit. They're actually going around each other. If they were the same mass, they would, be going like that. But, if like Jupiter pulls on our sun quite a bit because it's a big, massive planet. Earth doesn't really move it around. But the planets are kind of moving around. The stars are moving around kind of at walking speed, a few meters per second. And if we could detect that with the Doppler effect, so, when it's moving toward you, the light of the star would get a little bluer, and when it's moving away, you guys know about the Doppler effect, the Doppler shift? People who study physics know about that, astronomy. Okay, anyway, the colors shift depending on if it's moving toward you and away from you, and it doesn't change very much, but that's why it was a really hard measurement to make. But if you can see a star wiggling, that betrays the presence of a planet going around it. And that's how the first planets were formed. There's a new method that a lot of people are using called the occultation method. I don't know if you can see it, but this is, you put a camera in space, and occasionally the planet, you see that little dot in front of the star there? That little dot obscures some of the light, and the star will dim down a little bit when the planet goes in front of it. And it'll do that periodically as the planet goes around, it gets in front of the star, and then you wait another year or whatever, and then it dims down again. And if you see that dimming of the star, it doesn't dim much because the planet is much smaller than the star. That's why I have to do this in space. If you do it from the ground, the stars are twinkling because of the atmosphere and diffraction. But if you go in space and you see a dimming star, that means there's a planet going in front of it. And Kepler was a thing that looked at about a few 100,000 stars, and they found lots of planets and all kinds of planets, some at the right kind of distance, the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold. So there's a lot of planets. There are a lot of places where you could have life. And then you might remember, well, the next thing is, okay, you got a good planet. How often does life get started? And we really don't know, but it might get started in something like this, the primordial soup. And people have done experiments where they simulate the early conditions of Earth. So what we knew 4.5 billion years ago, there was methane, ammonia, water, hydrogen. So people put that stuff in a flask, and we knew there was lightning, so they put sparks in there. And you don't get gorillas crawling out of this thing, but you do get the basic building blocks of life, the amino acids and things that you and I are made of. And fairly complicated chemicals can be made fairly easily. And you might have read about these asteroids that they found recently that have all the nucleotides in the DNA and RNA that we're made of. So it looks pretty easy to make all the sort of proteins and molecules you need to make self-replicating molecules, but we don't know how often that happens. And then we really don't know how often how long it takes to go, or if it goes from simple life to intelligent life. However, there's a lot of different intelligent creatures. Some of them have bigger brains, more complex brains than we do. And so there does seem to be, at least on a planet as complex as ours, there are evolutionary selection pressures that make intelligence advantageous. So there are lots of ways to succeed in evolution. You can run fast or have a shield, or you can also be smart. There's lots of pressures that can make creatures successful, but in a complex environment, intelligence can be advantageous. So maybe there is selection pressure, but we don't know how often that happens. So there might even be life in our own backyard. So Europa is a moon going around Jupiter, and there may be life on there because it has an ocean that covers the whole planet, and that's a cutaway view. There is a problem, though. If we're going to see if there's something swimming in that ocean, it's covered with ice, about 30 miles thick of ice, and we don't know how to get through that ice. Sometimes I give talks in high school, and I ask the kids, how are we going to get through the ice? And the boys don't want to use like bombs and machine guns. They want to shoot their way through the ice. And the girls, they usually want to melt their way through the ice with like magnifying glasses or concentrate the mirrors. Anyway, one girl said, could you build like a submarine with a radioactive hull that would heat up the hull of the submarine, a little small submarine, and coat the hull with thermocouples to generate electricity? It's quite impressive. So it turns out you don't have to get through the ice. There's another moon going around Saturn, and it's got the same deal. It's got the liquid ocean and covered with ice, but there are cracks in the ice, and there are these fissures, and there are plumes. The water is squirting out and making this kind of misty stuff. And NASA and the Europeans are figuring out how we could fly a spacecraft through the plume there and see if there's something alive. Or so maybe I think in your lifetimes, probably in 10 or 20 years, we'll be able to fly through that plume and tell you if there's life in our own backyard. If there's life in our own backyard, right in our own solar system, that means the universe is teeming with life. Okay, but the question that we are working on, and let's see, who are the people here? Ian is a new guy in our group, and Ben, and there are a couple people online, Wei Lu. When I say we are working on it, I don't do any of the work. I get the credit for the work, but these guys are the guys that do the work. Can you guys raise your hand, please? Those guys, you should talk to them and ask them what they're doing. Anyway, so I want to talk to you about kind of how we're looking for technology. So SETI is really they call it techno signatures. And first, before I get into that, I want to talk about some of the original ideas for how we might find ET. And then I'll talk about what we're going to do now, and then I'll talk about what we want to do, in the next couple of decades. So one of the early ideas was by a mathematician, Carl Gauss, and he said what we should do to get in touch with ET is make large geometric structures on the Earth, and ET would see this. And what he suggested was a triangle of pine trees, maybe 3, 4, 5 miles on a side, and then a big squares and then ET would see the structure on the Earth with their telescope, and they'd, these guys know about the Pythagorean theorem, and then they would get in touch. And then it was a cool idea, but not funded. And then von Littron, also a couple hundred years ago, he said, to get in touch with ET, you dig a circular ditch 20 miles across, fill that ditch with kerosene, and use this match, not to scale, and make a bright circle of fire, and ET would see this bright ring and get in touch. And I think you can guess what happened with that. And then also a couple hundred years ago, Charles Crow said, we should get in touch with the Martians by reflecting sunlight to the Martians, and actually several mirrors, one where he lived in Paris and the others to outline the shape of the Big Dipper. So ET would see this constellation of bright lights on Earth, and that same thing happened with that. So the first funded project was to send pornography into space. So you might recognize this. It was a plaque on the Pioneer 10 spacecraft that left the Earth in 1971, I think. And this plaque, this was a spacecraft. Well, actually, on the plaque, you can see how it went. So here's the sun and Mercury, Venus, Earth, and here's the spacecraft leaving the Earth, going out past Jupiter, and it had enough escape velocity to go out of our solar system. And it's, I think it's maybe not quite the furthest thing away that we've ever sent, but it's on its way to the stars. But these spacecraft travel slowly. It's not going to get near a star in about 1 million years. Spacecraft are, 25,000 miles an hour, kind of not very fast. But if you don't mind waiting 1 million years, it might get near a star, and then they would see this plaque on the spacecraft. There was a lot of controversy about these two people. They originally were holding hands, but NASA said, well, maybe ET will think it's one creature instead of two. And then for scale, they're standing next to the spacecraft. These are directions to, and the timing of the pulsars, the periods of different pulsars in looking in different directions. So they'll know where we live, and they can come eat us if they want. So anyway, that was the first kind of funded project. So there's another idea of how we might find civilizations, and that is we're beginning to develop this capability where we could take the spectrum of the atmosphere of a distant planet, an exoplanet, and you could find out what the atmosphere is made of. Every molecule and atom radiates at a different frequency, a different color. And so you take a spectrum and you can find out, oh, there's water there, and there's plants, chlorophyll. And so you might detect the presence of life just from the gases that are in the atmosphere of an exoplanet. And already we found planets that have water on it. We haven't found something like, oh, there's smog there, or there's photosynthesis there. But the easy things that we're already starting to with the nearby exoplanets, we can actually find out if they're really big planets. We can find out what a few of the elements and molecules in the atmosphere. And I think maybe in your lifetimes we'll be able to see if there's primitive life that's changing the atmosphere. There was no oxygen in our atmosphere until plants, photosynthesis changes carbon dioxide into oxygen, but there was no oxygen around in the early first few billion years until plants generated it. And now the atmosphere has completely changed because of life. So that's the kind of thing that we might be able to detect. So there's another kind of idea that you could do is for a very advanced civilization. Kardashev and Dyson talked about what very advanced civilizations would do, and they might want a lot of energy. So one way to get a lot of energy is to build a big shell around your star and capture all the energy from your star. Kardashev talked about civilizations that just capture all the energy hitting their planet. That's Kardashev type 1. Kardashev type 2 is somehow you capture all the energy coming out of your star, not just the stuff that's hitting your little planet. That's what a cut Dyson sphere is. The reason you could detect that because it would get hot, it would radiate in the infrared, and people have looked for these infrared excesses. The problem is that it's confusing because some stars have a lot of dust around them, and that behaves like a Dyson sphere. It absorbs the visible light and re-radiates it in the infrared, and that dust is warm. So people thought, oh, we found ET, but it turned out to be dust. Anyway, so Kardashev said, okay, type 1 is all the energy that hits your planet. Type 2 is all the energy coming out of your star. Type 3 is you build these things around every star in the galaxy, and that so you get all the energy in your galaxy. Type 4 is all the galaxies in your universe. Then type 5 is all the galaxies in the multiverse. Anyway, so what we've been thinking about, and this is not my idea, but the idea is we could maybe find these guys if they have radio or TV or cell phones or radar signals. And this is a plot of television power leaving the Earth as a function of time. And you can see the Earth, this is log scale. So the Earth is getting very bright. It's we are much brighter than the sun at television frequencies. So we are pretty easy to detect. We've been sending out television now, like I Love Lucy, Ed Sullivan have gone past about 10,000 stars traveling at the speed of light. And the nearby stars have seen The Simpsons and so we're polluting space with all kinds of radio signals, radio, television, radar, navigational beacons, all that stuff goes out through the atmosphere, out into space. And we've even sent messages intentionally. This is very controversial. I don't think it's a good idea, but people have done it. The reason that it's controversial is we're kind of a young civilization. We're emerging civilization. We're just learning what's out there. And it's kind of like shouting in a forest before you know if there's lions and tigers in the forest. Maybe we shouldn't be calling attention to ourselves. Maybe they're just going to come and grind up our planet. My thinking, a lot of people think that because we're so young and we don't know what's out there, we should just be listening at first and just trying to figure out what's out there and learn more about our universe before we transmit out. But people have done it, and they think maybe a good way to do it is send pictures. They're not going to speak English. And so this is the solar system. Here's the sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth is tipped toward the person. Here's DNA molecule. Here's the telescope that it was sent, the diameter of the telescope, population of Earth, amino acids. Anyway, so you can maybe send pictures. So there's a couple of things you could look for. One would be the kind of stuff I was talking about, an artifact of their civilization that they didn't mean to send to us. It just, they have their internal communication and we can receive it just like our television goes off into space. Another might be that if they know about us, they've seen oxygen in our atmosphere, they've seen our TV signals or photosynthesis, they might deliberately send us a signal. And if we get a signal that's deliberately sent to us, it'd probably be easy to decode. Maybe they've done it 100 times before and they know what kind of what works for communication. Maybe make it easy to decode, anti-cryptographic, a lot of pictures and language lessons, but we could learn a lot. And it's going to be really hard to find a civilization if they just discovered radio the way that we have in the last. It's more likely that we discover the first civilization. We can't find them if they're like trees and bacteria. They don't emit radio with signals. But so it's much more likely that if we ever find a civilization, they're going to be like 1 billion years ahead of us or a couple billion years ahead of us. So we could learn a lot. Okay, so we have a group we call it the Berkeley SETI Research Center. And there's about 20 people, and we're funded by the Breakthrough Foundation and the National Science Foundation, NASA, and a lot of individual donors, and some companies donate equipment. And my main motivation is I want to park out in front here. So I thought it'd be nice to have that parking permit. So one of the big problems in SETI is that we don't know what frequency, what wavelength to look at. And the spectrum is like, it's radio, infrared, visible, ultraviolet, gamma, X-ray. We don't know where they might be broadcasting. And we don't have the technology now. Earthlings don't know how to look at all the different wavelengths. So we're really just getting in the game right now. We can cover bands. We try to look at bands that get through the atmosphere. Some bands don't get through the atmosphere, so you do the easy stuff, the ones that reach the ground. And we can't do like a whole systematic search of like, the parameter space is vast. Like you got to cover the whole sky. We don't know where to point our telescope. We don't know what frequency they might be broadcasting on. We don't know how powerful. We don't know what kind of signal is it, AM, FM. So we're just beginning to learn how to do this. We're just getting in the game. But the good news is it's the technology is changing very fast, and it's limited a lot. It's by computing power and technology, and that's growing kind of exponentially. So even though I think right now we'd be very lucky to find these guys, we don't even know if they're out there, but if they are out there, I think we're just kind of in a very primitive state, but it's growing very quickly. And so this could easily happen in your lifetime. We have a project called the Breakthrough Listen Project that has radio telescopes and optical telescopes in different places. They're not our telescopes. We use these big international facilities and national facilities. We have a project called SERENDIP, and SERENDIP is an acronym. So if you're funded by NASA, they require acronyms. Search for extraterrestrial radio emissions from nearby developed intelligent populations. And we use these radio telescopes. this is the one in Northern California. It was a UC Berkeley observatory called Hat Creek Observatory. And it's this radio telescope is 85 feet across. And while we were using it to look for ET, this is what happened to it. So this is what the dish used to be up on the pedestal here. So we said, okay, well, that's the end of that telescope. So then we went to this telescope, which is even bigger in West Virginia. It's 300 feet across. And while we were using this telescope to look for ET, that's what happened to that telescope. And then we started using Lick Observatory, which is up in the mountains above San Jose. And there was a big fire that almost burned down our telescope. And then we started using this telescope, which is in Puerto Rico. And it was the largest telescope. And that's what happened to that telescope while we were using it. And this is I don't know if they're going to be able to see this on Zoom, but this is, oh, okay, my movies aren't working. Okay, so you might ask, why is this happening to Dan? Why are all these telescopes being destroyed? According to the World Weekly News, the ET did not want to be discovered, and they zapped these telescopes, zapped by hostile space aliens. So I mentioned that one of the problems in SETI is we don't know what frequency to look at, what channel to look at. And so what we do is we build, instead of like tuning a radio dial to this channel and, oh, let's try that channel and let's try that channel, one channel at a time, we build these things called multi-channel spectrum analyzers, which listen to a whole bunch of frequencies simultaneously. And that speeds up the search. So here's channel number 2,264,191. Here's channel number 2,264,000. And here's a strong signal at one of those frequencies. That's the kind of thing we look for. And I wish I could tell you this is ET, but it's actually a satellite going over. So the problem is we're looking for signals from ET, but we find signals from Earthlings, from terrestrials. And this radio pollution from satellites and people with their cell phones and television and radar, it's getting worse and worse. Though some of the bands in the spectrum are completely occupied, and we can't, if there was ET broadcasting, we'd have no chance of finding it. The problem is that there are more and more parts of the spectrum are being occupied, more and more television signals, more cell phone, more Wi-Fi. Elon Musk is sending up all these satellites. So this may be a kind of unique window in Earthlings history where we can still do these SETI experiments before the whole electromagnetic spectrum is filled up with kind of radio pollution. Now, there are ways to get around that. Like you could go to the backside of the moon. The moon acts like a big shield, and if you put a telescope there, you don't get all the pollution from Earth. But that would be really expensive. But there are some people that work in our lab that are building a little tiny telescope that's going up in a couple of years just to learn how to do that, but not for SETI. Another problem is the signals may not be just sitting at one frequency, but they might be drifting. So these are example. This is time frequency. This is an example of a signal that's changing with time. It's changing in frequency. Or this one's going up. Oops, sorry. And so now, why would they do that? Because the transmitters are on probably a planet that's spinning around like we go around every 24 hours. So that introduces this Doppler shift, and so that the frequencies are changing depending on where the transmitter is as it's spinning around its axis around. And so you have to look for these drifting patterns, and that turns out to be you can see these things with your eye. The computers can see it, but the problem is with our eye, we have about 100 million of these things to look at every second. And that would take a lot of eyeballs and brains. So we train the computers to look for these patterns, but that takes a lot of computing power. And then we have another kind of thing we look for is pulses, bip, 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 bip. And here I've regularly spaced pulses, and I've circled the pulses, and that makes it very easy for your eye. But if I take off the circles and I just say, look for a regularly spaced set of pulses, that actually is kind of hard to do. Your eye will probably not find that pattern, but computers can do it. But also that takes a lot of computing power. So, yeah.
Actually determine that those lines are real, because like it's very easy, right, to fall into a pattern of like just seeing a bunch of lines, and your mind will draw lines for you.
Yeah, and if I take away these lines and I just show a little bit, oh, I can't tell that like that, but it's yeah, you're absolutely right. You can find all kinds of patterns in there, and the eye's really good at that. So what we do is we have some kind of signal to noise measurement. We measure the power along the line, and we say, is this really statistically significant? So there's some statistical mathematical tests that you draw a little kind of rectangle around it, and you add up all the power of the intensity along those dots. You compare it with, like, what if I drew a random number, a random slope thing, how much stronger is this than what I'd expect from noise? And you can work that out. And you can't say for sure this is ET, but you can say what the statistics are and how rare that thing you found is. And then what you eventually have to do is, I'll get into this a little later, but nobody's going to believe you if they just show you a thing like, oh yeah, I found something that's really strong, because it could be interference, it could be radio pollution. So what you have to do is go back with the telescope and look at it again. Everybody then argues about it, and other people start looking at it. But yeah, nobody's going to believe that first one line or something like that. So we need a lot of computing power to do this. And some of you might know about this project called SETI at Home. What we decided was, in order to get all this computing power, we'd ask people around the world who had laptop computers or cell phones or desktop computers to help us analyze the data. And we built, what we did is we recorded the data at the Arecibo telescope, a couple of petabytes of data, and we sent it out to the volunteers, and they ran this screensaver. So you download this free program, and when you go out for a cup of coffee or something, it pops up. But instead of just putting a pretty picture on your screen, it's actually going through the data looking for these kind of patterns. And then when it's done analyzing that, so everybody gets a little piece of the sky. You get one part, you get another part, and then when you're done analyzing that piece of work you've been assigned, then you send the results back, any interesting signals that you found. And your name is attached to the data, so you might get the parking spot with me if you find ET. We did at the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico, we ran that experiment for 20 years. And we covered a lot of the sky, almost all the sky that Arecibo can see, and many of the parts of the sky multiple times. And we look for different kinds of patterns, these things called Gaussians, pulses, and we look for different things. And we ended up, the volunteers, there were 8 million volunteers in 200 countries, and they built the biggest supercomputer on the planet, all these people with their laptop helping us analyze the data. And it made an incredibly sensitive search, much more sensitive than we or anybody had ever done before, because we had all this computing power. It was a very powerful thing. And then we ended up with, like, a lot of these. We set our thresholds kind of low. You were asking me, like, how do you? So we deliberately set it so that it wouldn't have to be like a 10 sigma event, just a 3 sigma event or something. And we ended up with billions of things in our database, these Gaussians and pulses and stuff like that. And then we had to go through and figure out, was it interference? What was it? Did we see it multiple times and all this kind of stuff? And we kind of scored them and ranked them. And then now what we're doing is we're going to the Arecibo telescope. I showed a picture, it fell apart, but we're now using the FAST telescope, which is a fairly new telescope in China. It's even bigger than Arecibo. It's the world's largest radio telescope. And we're going now using this telescope to look at our very best candidates from the SETI at Home project. And we've looked at, I think, a couple hundred candidates so far. And we're just going through that data now, trying to figure out, is this real? Is it something to get excited about? Yeah.
You know how long it'll be until this telescope?
I don't want to get near that question. Yeah, I'm actually going there next month, and I'm not going to show them any of those slides. That's, oh shit, we got to avoid. Dan should not use this telescope. Okay, so we haven't found ET, but we have. Some of the work that we've done has led to other discoveries and other kind of fun things. One of the things is just education. A lot of kids ran SETI at Home. We developed this curriculum with Lawrence Hall Science where kids would make up how you're going to talk to ET. And this question, are we alone? It's a really good thing to get kids interested in astronomy and biology. How does life get started and how do telescopes work? And it touches on physics, astronomy, biology, evolution. There's a lot of chemistry. How does life get started? So it's a kind of interesting hook because it's so multidisciplinary. You can talk about all these different sciences to kids. They can learn a lot of stuff. We also made SETI at Home was we made a kind of more general. By the way, all of our software and hardware is open source. We made this thing that made it possible for people to do not just SETI on their home computers, but all kinds of different projects now. There's about 100 of them that you can run on your computer. So you can do you can look for cancer drugs when you're with your spare computing cycles, or HIV, COVID-19 drugs. I think pretty soon we're going to have a bird flu project. And then you can do astronomy projects, gravitational waves, pulsar timing. You can help look for new planets. There are a lot of projects that need computing power. There's a climate change project, global warming, and you can kind of pick your favorite projects to participate in and use your cell phone or your laptop to, we call it the democratization of supercomputing or scientific supercomputing. This is the SETI at home one. This is climate prediction, global warming. This is gravitational wave project. This is looking at black holes. This is protein folding. And so the other thing that happened was that was the kind of open source software that we developed to get people engaged in science and building big supercomputers and working on different science projects. But we also, it turned out the instruments that we were building for SETI we also had a lot of computing power at the telescope and signal processing, and all that stuff turned out to be useful for a lot of other astronomy projects. And we used our instrumentation that we developed. SETI was used to make the first images of a black hole. They discovered these things called fast radio bursts. They've discovered a lot of pulsars. The stuff that we originally developed for SETI now is used at almost all radio telescopes, and it led to a lot of discoveries. A planet made out of solid diamond. Recently, using instruments that we originally developed for SETI, they measured the time arrival of these pulsars and figured out the universe is jiggling around like a lot of jello. And so that was a kind of recent discovery that was made with these instruments. And we spun off a whole group called the Collaboration for Astronomy, Signal Processing, Electronics Research that's kind of helping everybody build these instruments to make all these discoveries. And that's what Ben and Ian are working on, is actually figuring out how to help people build instruments that was originally based on SETI technology. It's used a little bit in other things outside of astronomy. We did this thing where we could put electrodes in the brain and get data out of the brain. And we think eventually that'll be used to control prosthetic arms. So anyway, so there are a bunch of spin-offs. We haven't found ET yet, but some people have been able to use what we've learned for other things. So I want to talk a little bit about where we might go in the future. So I mentioned this big telescope. That's what we're doing a sky survey there and some targeted work. And there's another kind of way to build telescopes. Instead of a single dish, you can make a telescope out of lots of little dishes. And we think that'll be the future of radio astronomy. And this doesn't exist. This is artist conception called the square kilometer array. But there are prototypes of this thing in South Africa and in Australia. And they're actually going to build one in Nevada with 2,000 dishes. I'll call it DSA 2000. And so that might be this is not just for SETI. I mean, there's all kinds of things you do with these radio telescopes, but we're probably going to do SETI on these things. There's a new experiment that we've been working on, which is not looking for radio signals, looking for optical signals. So maybe ET has a laser. And this experiment is looking for flashes of light, like a nanosecond pulse of light. And the problem is you don't know where it's going to come from. It's like looking for a lighthouse. Should you look there and look there? And you don't know how, maybe the flash is only going off once a month or something like that. So if you do, most of these telescopes, you just look at a little tiny part of the sky at a time. So you're looking there, but the flash might be over there. So we want to build a telescope that can look at a big chunk of the sky to be able to detect these rare flashes. And so we think it'll look something like this with a bunch of telescopes poking out in different directions. Each telescope covers about 100 square degrees. So the thing we've done before was we'd just look at one place on the sky, and then we'd move it around. Oh, let's look at that star, that star, that star. But it'd be easy to miss these flashes if they're out there. So we have this new thing. We just have 3 telescopes at Lick Observatory, about a 2-hour drive from now. And we're excited about this. We don't have the 100 telescopes that we want to build, but we just got money to build 10, and we'd like to scale up to 100. And we're excited about this because we're looking for kind of a time scale that nobody's really looked at before. So most astronomers, they have cameras that you might open the shutter for like, I don't know, a minute or an hour or something like that. So you wouldn't be able to see a very short flash. But this camera that we built can actually make a movie of the sky at about 1 billion frames a second. So we can look for kind of nanosecond flashes. And So that is kind of unexplored territory, unexplored parameter space. And it turns out in astronomy, we don't understand why, but if you just build some new gadget and you can look at some new part of the parameter space, a new size scale or a new wavelength that nobody's looked at before. In this case, we're looking at a new time scale that nobody's looked. It turns out nature seems to populate all of phase space, all parameter space with stuff. So there's something in astronomy at all size scales and all wavelengths. There seems to be phenomena. So we think maybe if we look at a new time scale, maybe we'll find something interesting. We don't know, evaporating black holes or something new. It turned out to be useful for other science too. There's this really interesting question in astronomy about where are these very high energy gamma rays coming from? We don't know. They're just incredible. They have a lot more energy than anything that we can make at the CERN accelerators in Switzerland or anything. A peta-electron volt, and we don't know what's causing it or where they're coming from. And it turns out PANOSETI is a pretty good telescope for maybe answering that question. And there's another thing that we didn't originally build PANOSETI to do this, but there's there's a big question in astronomy. What is this dark matter? We know it's out there, but we don't know what it is. And one idea is that if two pieces of dark matter collide with each other, they would emit these gamma rays, and we could detect them and maybe figure out a little bit about dark matter as well. Okay, so I mentioned that right now Earthlings are just getting in the game. We're learning how to do this, but I'm kind of optimistic that if there are signals out there, and I'm optimistic because of all these different kind of Moore's law kind of curves. This is radio telescopes getting better and better. We're limited by computing power. Of course, that's growing exponentially. Moore's law. And if you look at kind of, well, my first thing that I built could listen to 100 channels at once. Now we're listening to like 50 billion channels at once, not because I'm smarter, just because we just take all the stuff coming out of Silicon Valley and put it to good use. But if you kind of look at, if you compress the age of the Earth, which is 4.5 billion years, into one day, all this stuff has happened in the last thousandth of a second. So, this is all just a blink of an eye in Earth's history. We went from one channel to 34 billion channels in the last millisecond of Earth's history, if Earth was a day old. So in the long run, we don't know how to do this now, but the biggest telescope we have, I showed you a picture of it, it's 500 meters across in China. But the sun is much bigger than that. And you can use the sun, it bends gravity. Einstein, it has gravity and it bends light. Einstein told us about that. And you can use the sun as a giant telescope. You put your camera, you got to go out back by Pluto, but the light, then you have a telescope as big as the sun. And with that, you could read like license plates on extrasolar planets. So that we don't know how to do that yet, but maybe in 100 years. So a couple of my favorite quotes. So Phil Morrison said that SETI is the archaeology of the future. So I think what he meant by that was that if we ever find ET, it's going to be very hard to find like the primitive, trees and bacteria. And it's going to be very hard to find them if they're just emerging like us, just basically just invented radio. So if we ever find these guys, they're going to be a billion years. So we can learn, all their music, poetry, literature, science, medicine. How did they get through their bottlenecks when they were killing each other? So we can learn kind of what's in our future, maybe how to get on the galactic internet. We'll get on talking to all these other civilizations. Carl Sagan's quote was that I like is, SETI is profound either way. So I think what he meant was that if we find ET, that's very profound. We'll know we're not alone. It kind of calibrates our place in the universe. But if we do a thorough search, and we can't do this now, but eventually we might be able to look at all these different wavelengths and look for all these different kinds of signals. We don't see anything. That's very profound also. It means that life is incredibly precious and rare, and we better take really good care of life on our planet. This last slide. Oh, no, it's not. So this is kind of a summary if you've been asleep. No ET so far. We're still working on it. But I do have a couple more. So the people that participate in SETI at Home, they helped us in a lot of ways. They helped us write the software. Some of them composed music about SETI. Some of them sent money. And some of them sent us haikus. And people sent us thousands of haikus. I'll just read you a couple. Paula Cook searching for life, answers are revealed about ourselves. And this is the last slide and the last haiku. 1 million earthlings, bounded by optimism, leave their PCs on. So thank you. So you guys got questions, comments, anything? Yeah.
So I guess I don't quite understand logistically when talking about trying to measure the extremely short time scale light pulses, how that like wouldn't appear as a signature on something with a long exposure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like how would you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So the question is, why do you need to search for these really short nanosecond timescale pulses? Wouldn't they show up on these astronomy things where they integrate for a minute or an hour or something like that? And you're right. So if somebody sends you a flash and you've opened your shutter for a minute, that all those photons will still get in there and they'll register. But the problem is if you open your shutter for a minute, there's all kinds of light coming from the stars and the galaxy that comes in there. And so, so roughly what's going on is that there's kind of on average, you get a photon every microsecond. So, but it's, you never see or almost never see like 10 photons all hit you in a billionth of a second. If you can work out what the probability is, and it might happen once every 100 years or something like that. So if you ever see a whole bunch of photons all come at you at once in a very short time, nature doesn't do that. We don't know of anything that can do that. If they're spread out, which is what happens, every microsecond or so. So the problem is if you just leave your shutter open, you get a whole bunch of photons. You don't know that they all came in a short little burst. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What would be the main advantage for using the small radio telescopes measured in the building in Nevada as compared to the one that I'm trying to do?
Yeah. Okay. So, so what's the advantage of building a telescope out of lots of little dinky things instead of one big dish? So, okay. So what's happening is that there's some scientific advantages. It turns out that the little dishes can see more of the sky at once. So the smaller you make a telescope, you see more of the sky. But the problem is with a small telescope, you don't collect very much light. You want a big bucket. So, but you could compensate for that by just having lots of telescopes. So what happened was that it's nice to have a whole bunch of telescopes, but it's very expensive. The thing you put at the focus used to cost $1 million, the cryogenic receiver and all that stuff. So if you're going to build a thing with 1,000 telescopes, that's $1 billion. But what happened was the electronics cost came way down. And now we can build the thing at the focus for a few $100s. And so, and those little things, you can stamp them out like hot tubs. So it's actually cheaper now to build a telescope out of lots of little dishes, and you can see more of the sky. So that's kind of the future. I think there won't be so many big dishes anymore. It'll be lots of little things. And I think it has to do with the cost of electronics coming down, but the cost of steel doesn't. Cost of steel is always the same price as hamburger or whatever per pound. Doesn't change. Any more questions, comments? Yeah.
That's kind of an out there question, but so a lot of your focus has to deal with communication in, like, as you say, the NC, right? The channels that we know how we can communicate. Do you have any idea, or is anyone working on communicating with intelligent life that may or may not utilize the electromagnetic spectrum?
Oh yeah, okay. So is anybody looking at communicating outside of the electromagnetic spectrum, something else besides photons? So yeah, so photons we think are probably good because they travel at the speed of light. They don't cost a lot. We know how to do that. We know how to communicate. If you had these big telescopes on the other side of the galaxy, we could actually talk to somebody on the other side of the galaxy with technology that we have if they have the same technology. So that's encouraging. But there are Alfvén waves, there's gravitational waves. those things are pretty hard to detect, and they're very hard to generate. You know, if you have a pair of black holes and you move them around each other, you can generate gravitational waves. But so we think photons are the best, but actually space travel is interesting. Like, even though it's very slow, if you don't mind waiting a million years, then you could maybe travel to another star or something like that. So that we think photons are the best, but it's interesting. Your question is interesting. Like, if you looked at the future, if you looked at those early ideas from a couple hundred years ago, those were the best ideas of the time, right? So there's, one guy said fire, one guy said mirrors, one guy said build a triangle, and those, everybody thought that was really cool. Let's do that. And now I'm saying, let's look for radio waves. That's really cool. So that means that in 200 years, people are going to say, Dan is an idiot. He should have used tachyons, something that travels faster than the speed of light. But we don't know what that is. But it could easily be that we're doing the wrong thing. And as you know, there's a lot of unknowns in physics, and we don't understand a lot of important questions. So it could easily be that there's something that works even better than photons, that goes faster, or lower energy, or something like that. But you can't really do what you don't know how to do. And so I think you just got to use the best tools of the time. Like, if you told, I don't know, Christopher Columbus wanted to sail to India to find spices, and if you said, that's crazy, don't use these ships to go get the spices in India. Just wait, there'll be airplanes, and you can go much faster. But he found something interesting. So you just got to use but you're absolutely right. There could be something way better. And but you just got to do what the best you know. Yeah.
Did you say that 1 billion frames per second?
I did say that.
How do you guys handle the data?
Oh, okay. Right. So the question is, did I say 1 billion frames a second? And yeah, so it turns out that data rate that you just mentioned is like, you could never get it out of there into a computer. So we actually have custom chips, right? So there's the telescope, and then it comes down to this, what we call the focal plane, where we got our very fast detectors. And it turns out you got to process the data right there and look for these flashes of light. You can't, there's not even a transport way to get it off of that focal plane. So we have a bunch of, and in fact, these guys specialize in that kind of stuff. And we're really nerds when it comes to like signal processing and getting data and processing it in situ. It's kind of our specialty, where the data rates are so high, you got to do it right there. And I'm kind of a half astronomer, half electronics computer nerd. And so, yeah, you're right. It's a lot of data. I don't know what the schedule is. Maybe we should wrap it up. And if people have questions, just come on up and we can chat informally. Thanks a lot.